So after about 200 straight videos of nothing but Steam Deck and Steam ecosystem content, it's clear that I have a lot of love for Valve's Handheld. But considering I've historically been a console gamer and one that grew up right alongside Nintendo from the early NES days to present, of course I was going to be super pumped for the Switch 2 whenever it finally dropped. And given that they're both handheld hybrids, naturally there was going to be a lot of overlap there for me to dissect or contrast and compare, and really just break down the differences of one system versus the other. And having now spent a little bit over a month with the Switch 2, there were definitely some advantages that it has over the Steam Deck, and that's what today's video is all about, are the explicit things that I like more about the Switch 2 than I do the Steam Deck. And then next week I'll do a follow-up on this video going the opposite direction because this definitely doesn't tell the entire story. But for now, let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at some of the different areas in which I've kind of compared the Switch 2 to the Steam Deck, starting first with hardware, then usability and experience, and then finally, of course, playing games. So starting off on the hardware front, I definitely appreciate the portability of the Switch 2 more than the Steam Deck. Not just because it has a slimmer profile, but the fact that it has those detachable Joy-Cons means you have even more flexibility for storing this in a small space and taking it with you on the go. Whether that's throwing it into a backpack or a bag, or if you want, you can actually stuff it into a cargo pocket without too much work, it's just an easier system to take around with you, despite the fact that you wouldn't call it pocketable really in any sense of the word. And when it comes to comfort, I also find the Switch 2 to be more comfortable than the Steam Deck, in a sense. This is actually a fairly evenly matched area, so I'll expand on it more whenever I do the opposite video when I talk about what I liked about the Steam Deck more than the Switch 2, but as it stands, I have to say the reduced weight and slimmer profile definitely make it more comfortable to hold overall for extended periods of time. And again, that does come with some caveats, but I'll probably drill into those more whenever I do the follow-up video. And this next one does feel a little bit like a cop-out, particularly given that physical games on the Switch 2 have been a point of contention considering the adoption of game keycards by Nintendo, but the physical game experience really is something that I really like about the Switch 2. And I know that generally speaking, digital games can be cheaper and more convenient, but there's just something about having the tactile experience of a physical game, especially in the modern age when you open one up and you don't know if it's going to include something like an instruction manual or any additional goodies or something like that, or if it might surprise you with some nice interior artwork or a full-blown reversible cover for displaying on your shelf, not to mention the ability to trade, resell, or in my case, often lend games to friends and family, so they can just hop into that experience and see it for themselves immediately without any real hoops to jump through. Not to mention when you get physical games for the Switch 2, it does provide a sort of communal experience of actually going out to a game store and hanging out with other like-minded players. It's not a common thing that you see that much these days, and certainly you don't see very many midnight launches, despite the fact that I had a great time at the Switch 2 midnight launch itself, but these are experiences that are really kind of synonymous with playing on consoles, and it's something I can't really get from the Steam Deck, but I very much appreciate for the Switch 2. And I would say that in that time period leading up to the Switch 2's launch, I wasn't really spending nearly as much time when I was heavily focused on the Steam Deck, really going to game stores that much. But since the Switch 2, I would say I've been hitting up a local shop at least once or twice a week at this point, and it really did go a long way towards sort of reigniting my passion for console gaming in a way that had been kind of dormant since I've been so largely focused on the Steam Deck. But now let's move on to that middle ground between the actual gaming hardware of the Switch 2 and the Steam Deck and the actual gameplay of those two systems, and talk about the usability and experience a little bit. And one of my favorite features of the Switch 2 is something that was present on the Switch, but I forgot how great it could be, and that is the detachable Joy-Cons that basically give you an instant co-op experience with a buddy, anytime, anywhere. And it's not that you can't take the Steam Deck with you and also have a similar co-op experience, but it also doesn't have a built-in kickstand, it doesn't have detachable controllers by default, so naturally you'd have to haul around at least two extra controllers, which even if you had like those micro 8-bit Do controllers, it would still be a little bit more of a hassle than it is with the Switch. And I actually got to experience this firsthand with the Switch 2 just a little bit after launch. I went to meet up with a buddy of mine to go see a movie, and while we were waiting, the theater actually had those like little trays that kind of sit in front of you to put food on, and we immediately set up the Switch 2 and started playing Mario Kart with two Joy-Cons, which, again, the Joy-Con isn't the ideal way to play any game, it's not the most comfortable controller at all, but in a pinch, if you just want to have a good time and kill a few minutes with a buddy, it's pretty great for that. And speaking of multiplayer features, the other thing I really like about the Switch 2 is its game chat integration. Now, obviously, it's nowhere near as feature-rich as what you get on some of the other platforms like PlayStation or Xbox, and certainly not as flexible as something like Discord, but it is the only option there, and almost in a cop-out sort of way, it kind of scores some points for me in this arena. Because anytime I play PC games, whether that was on the Steam Deck or on my desktop rig, there's always that moment of hesitation or coordination, I guess, where a bunch of my friends would have to sort out, like, are we using in-game chat, are we using Discord, are we using Steam team chat or something else, and it always seems like there's a little bit of extra legwork to get everybody up and communicating. And even though the game chat feature for the Switch 2 is far from perfect, and it definitely has some caveats that I already mentioned in the review a couple weeks back, it's still pretty great to just hop in, immediately get connected with friends, and go. And this is made all the easier by its built-in microphone, which yes, the Steam Deck also has as well, but it is kind of a first for a Nintendo home console to have a feature like this, and I just love that they put the multiplayer and communal experience pretty front and center with this system. And because these are both hybrid systems, of course I have to point out the process of switching from playing in portable mode to playing in docked mode. And that is just way easier on the Switch 2. All you have to do is drop it in and go, and you don't really have to mess with any settings or anything to get a good experience when you hook it up to a TV. I mean, you might have to make some slight HDR adjustments or something like that, but by and large you can just drop this thing in and immediately switch from playing in portable mode to playing in docked mode. Meanwhile, on the Steam Deck, while you can play in docked mode, it's definitely a more nuanced experience where you'll often have to manually adjust resolution settings or really get into the nitty-gritty details of graphic options for each individual title to make sure you still have a smooth experience when you throw it on the big screen. Not to mention any ancillary friction from things like launchers on PC games or prompts that pop up asking you to confirm your resolution and details before you launch the game are a thing that never really happens on the Nintendo Switch 2, aside from maybe making adjustments for something like quality mode versus performance mode. And that absence of friction when transitioning from one mode of play to another is actually pretty nice after about 3 years straight of only playing on the Steam Deck. And to kind of dovetail off that last point, let's talk a little bit about the actual gameplay experience on these devices. And one of the things I love most about the Switch 2, aside from that lack of friction in transitioning from one mode to the other, depending on how I want to play, is that every game is going to run reasonably well. There are certainly Switch 1 games that don't necessarily run better on the Switch 2 just because they're natively capped at 30 FPS or something like that, but there's also no temptation at all, or really no real option for me to go ahead and dig into settings more fully and really fine-tune every individual graphic setting. On the Steam Deck, even when I was excited to play a game and just fire it up, it really wasn't like a situation where if I was going to play for an hour, I would just turn it on and then I'm playing games for an hour. There would be about 5 to 10 minutes where I would probably think to myself, hey, am I really getting the best experience I can here? Is there any way for me to, maybe reduce the resolution or reduce the effects that are being used on screen and maybe cap the frame rate at the system level to get a smoother portable experience? And there was a lot of that going on for just about every game that I've played on the Steam Deck, and I would say that's probably still true, but with the Switch 2, there really is none of that. Again, aside from maybe occasionally have to adjust like HDR settings or maybe switching from quality mode to performance mode, but by and large, if I sit down to play a Switch 2 game, I'm just immediately playing the game, and there's no temptation at all to do a ton of tinkering, nor is there ever really a need to. And once I'm there, particularly in portable mode, I just do find it more pleasing to play on the Switch 2 generally speaking. And I think a lot of that has to do with the larger screen and the fact that it's a more standard resolution at 1080p versus the slightly weirder aspect ratio for the Steam Deck, which I think is 1280 by 800 with a 16 by 10 versus a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So yeah, aside from just being the newer, shinier piece of hardware that currently gets the lion's share of my playtime, the Switch 2 does have some legitimate advantages over the Steam Deck. However, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this definitely doesn't tell the full story, because there are plenty of areas where the Steam Deck absolutely dunks on the Switch 2, and that's what I'll be talking about in next week's video. But hey, what about you? If you're a multi-platform gamer as well, and someone who also grabbed the Switch 2 while you already have a Steam Deck, I would love to hear your thoughts and see if there's anything that you notice that you just tend to like a little bit better about the Switch 2 over the Steam Deck, or vice versa, because that video is being worked on as well, and I'm sure your insights would have some very interesting things for me to dissect. As for what's coming up on the channel, like I already mentioned, I will be doing a counterpoint to this video, and then we'll also be taking a look at some of the games coming down the pike in August, so make sure to stay tuned for that. As always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here with me on the channel. It really means a lot to me. Take care, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.